Hi people, it's Archivist here, and today we're going to be taking a look at Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, the latest game developed by From Software, and yet another challenging adventure for me to destroy my sanity upon. So I think this game is maybe best described as a spin-off to the Dark Souls series, much in the same way that Bloodborne was. I was originally using the term successor, but that implies that this will be the new series taking over from Dark Souls, but I wouldn't bet my life on a Dark Souls 4 never coming to us. I mean, there's always that possibility. So let's, for the time being, consider this a spin-off to the main series. And with this spin-off, we see a change in setting. This is now late 1500 Sengoku Japan. It's of course not trying to be a historically accurate setting, even if it is trying to capture the look and the architecture. The moment a giant snake tries to eat you alive, you realise this is not a documentary on the period. And I suppose this will frustrate you if you wanted a Dark Souls game that was trying to root itself in reality, but if you like the fantasy element to those games, you will really enjoy it. There's also the way the combat has been slightly reworked. There's now a much greater emphasis on stealth and the importance of stealth, as well as the combat being more, I say even more technical than it was before, while sacrificing the RPG elements. That is not to say that you can't customize your character. In some ways you can do it in a more tangible way, but whereas before there was a focus on statistical upgrades as per a traditional RPG stat sheet, now it's more about getting a new ability or a new passive component or a new upgrade to your prosthetic arm. By the way, you have a prosthetic arm that you can use to grapple around the environment in an almost Spider-Man-like way. I suppose I could go on for ages explaining how the combat works in this game, but we'll start with just the fundamental area, and that is to do with the posture gauge. So there is no stamina bar anymore. You can swing your katana as much as you do please, but as you strike an enemy or as an enemy strikes you, you both have a posture gauge. And when this posture gauge fills up to max, you lose your ability to defend yourself, so you can be taken out by a devastating strike, or you can take your opponent out with a devastating strike, which the game refers to as a death blow. This death blow, by the way, is fantastically gory and a really satisfying way to finish off an opponent. I think that might have been something that was lacking from the Souls series before, where you would just, wail on an opponent until they go down, but now it's like I get to do a final flourish, and it can be quite useful, particularly as I've got an upgrade now where when I perform a death blow I get a little bit of health, so it's even more of an incentive to do it. And the idea is that you'll either fill up your opponent's posture gauge by striking them, which as you might imagine would knock them off balance, but you can also deflect their attacks, which is done by just as they're going to do a regular attack against you, you press whatever your deflect button is, and then it will basically lower their posture gauge. But if you do it at perhaps too early, then your gauge will go up. If you do it too late, well, you get hit because you didn't actually try and block them. But then it gets even more complex when you have these perilous attacks where they can, for example, do a sweeping blow, which doesn't matter if you're blocking at all, it will hit you anyway. There's also the thrust attack, but this is where we add an extra layer of complexity, where if an enemy, for example, has a spear and they go to do a thrust attack at you, then, well, on my controller I press the B button at just the right time after gaining a new ability, and it sort of stamps on their spear, and then you go in for a devastating attack. It does like massive posture damage to them. So, and I could go on for ages going through the nuances and the complexities and what counters what and what you have to do in what situation, but the very fact that I can go on for so long I think speaks to how nuanced this combat is. And it's, I felt, not as much about preparation, about bringing the right items to the fight, and more about knowing how you do that fight. Not to say that preparation isn't also important. I mean, there are, for example, certain candies that will boost your attack power or your resilience, but you do just seem to acquire these from going throughout the world, so I tended to have as many of these as I needed anyway. But it is far more about going into that battle, understanding the enemy's attacks, how you block them, how you parry them, how you jump out the way, when you just need to take an overall more complex idea. I mean, there's one enemy you fight at one point, for example, which you can't kill with a traditional death blow. You have to find out how to kill them in another way, which was quite nice. It wasn't even a main boss, it was a mini boss. And that's another thing. You have these primary bosses, which are, you know, like your traditional Souls series enemies. They're very tough. They're usually quite long fights as well. And then you have these mini bosses, which I found to be sometimes even harder than the main bosses. You can, once you learn their pattern, once you understand their weakness, they're usually a quicker fight. But I found them to be more unpredictable and more devastating. There was this one particular enemy. Unfortunately, I wasn't recording at the time, so you'll have to just go by what I say. But they were doing these attacks where effectively he would telegraph his attack with about half a second's worth of time between you needing to react to it and not. And you'd have to react just in time to deflect both his attacks. If you didn't do this, you'd lose pretty much most of your health in one go. And he would do this repeatedly, so if you messed up twice, you would die. But there's a twist. The plot thickens when you can actually resurrect now by default. I can't remember quite when I acquired the ability to resurrect, but it was very, very early on. And it's not just resurrecting back to your bonfire, or as they're now called, sculptor idols. You can resurrect right in the heart of combat, though you don't gain all your health back. And this means that I suppose you can have the option to either continue the fight, or in some cases you can retreat. You can say, I don't want to suffer the consequences of actually dying, so I'm going to know, okay, I was beaten, I'm going to resurrect now and run back and restore my health. And although in some cases you can't because it's a closed arena. And I'd say this sounds like it would make the game easier, but generally just in terms of overall feeling, no, I wouldn't say that. I think the game is just as challenging as the Souls series ever was. Challenging in perhaps slightly different ways, but challenging nonetheless. And I think in terms of my own personal preference, I actually enjoyed the combat more than a traditional Souls series game. I felt it was more visceral. I don't think anyone could argue that it's more visceral, but I really liked how the different enemies would completely change your style, where some would really invite you to have an aggressive style where it's just kill them as quick as you can. Others would force you to be more defensive, and some would make you be super evasive where you were jumping all over the place. Speaking of jumping all over the place, I think I briefly mentioned it, but you have a grappling hook now inside of your prosthetic arm. Also quickly, regarding your prosthetic arm, you can use this to equip certain additional powers, like you can throw shurikens, you can equip an axe and such. But in terms of agility, its ability to get you around the environment in a far more vertical fashion. So if, say, you're fighting an enemy, you realise it's a losing battle, you can use it to escape, is fantastic, rather than just having to clumsily run away. But it's also good for getting the drop on your opponent. As I spoke about, stealth is a big part of this game. And so there's a massive advantage to being able to get on top of a roof, for example, and decide, well, I need to take down this main enemy, but there's this gunman to the left who I know is going to make this a pain, so I can jump down from the roof and attack him. Whereas I think in previous games it would have been a case of you sort of go into the arena and you try and figure it out there. But the ability to get some elevation, scope out what you need to do, I think there's definitely something to that. And there are also a few scenarios where it pumps up the pressure on this, where you'll have to very quickly move around the environment or risk being eaten alive. I would say no more than that for now. In terms of the story, I think it's a little bit more transparent than the Souls series, more in line with Bloodborne, where it's quite easy to generally understand what's going on and to know why you're doing what you're doing. I mean, if you're truly not paying attention, you could get confused, but if you're at least listening to what's going on, I think you understand the primary drive of what's happening. But below that surface layer, there's this much deeper lore that can get you into the true nuances of the world, why certain things are the way they are. And I think that adds to the overall hardcore image of these sorts of games, where it's not just a case of the gameplay being challenging to get to grips with, but also the story itself. You have to invest quite a lot of time to truly know what's going on in this world, and that's no different with Sekiro. Graphically, I'm a big fan of this game. I played it on the PC, and that can be quite challenging to review because everyone's got a slightly different rig, so people will be choosing different graphic settings. I'm using a can't remember the model number, I'm afraid, but it's an i7 from, I think, 2015, and a GTX 1080 Ti, so it's like last gen's beast. No longer, you know, the amazing PC it once was, but it's still pretty decent, and I was able to get high settings, 4K, 60 frames per second. Some occasional dips, usually when I was using the grappling hook, funnily enough. But during general combat, when it actually mattered, it was a very solid 60 frames per second. So I would say, based on that, considering how open the environments are, how many NPCs you can have on the screen, and just the general nature of the game, that this is a well-optimized game for PC. So if you're a PC owner and you want to play this, I would definitely say don't be afraid, because sometimes we do get slightly dodgy PC ports, but this is not one. This is really good. In terms of art direction, it's really nice and creative, super dark, as From Software like to do, but also just from a technical standpoint, this is the most solid looking Souls-like game I have played yet, particularly in terms of the anti-aliasing, which sounds like a specific thing to say is good, but it really is. In previous Souls games, I found that no matter what I did, you would get a little bit of aliasing, which can detract from the overall image quality, but they're using what I think is a temporal anti-aliasing solution here, and also my understanding is that this is across consoles as well, so this isn't just a PC exclusive benefit, and this gives the overall look of the game a far more smooth, cohesive, cinematic look, which is a massive upgrade. And well, if they make another Dark Souls game, I'm confident they'll include this as well. And you know, sometimes in certain settings, this game can look downright beautiful. If I was to criticize anything, maybe the NPCs outside cutscenes can look a little bit basic, which has always been the case, to be honest, as well. But on the whole, this is a really solid package with some, you know, I struggle to say there are any major weaknesses with this. It really does, from a graphical standpoint, look very, very good. So, in terms of overall recommendations for Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, without a shadow of a doubt, the quality of this title cannot be called into question. It is a fantastically well-made game. In terms of the value it delivers, well, you can spend hours on this. I mean, it can be tricky to gauge it because, of course, it's not just how much content is there, and there is a lot of content, but also how long will it take you to beat that content. So in terms of how much is being delivered here, also is worth the money, but you have to go in knowing that you must be patient to play these sorts of games. There will be bosses that you go up against that even very early on will challenge you, and you will die over and over and over, but it's about understanding why you've died, thinking where might my opponent's weakness be and how can I exploit that, what does work, what doesn't work, am I trying something completely wrong, should I completely change my strategy. As long as you have the willingness to adopt that mindset of I will go in and lose, but I can learn from it and I can keep doing better, then you will enjoy this game and you will find it incredibly satisfying. If you don't have a lot of time to play games and you don't have a lot of patience to play a game that challenges you, probably not for you, to be perfectly honest, but otherwise this is a really solid experience, as good as any place to jump into the Soul series. I certainly wouldn't say you had to play any of the other games to get used to it. In fact, that might be a detriment in some respects because your muscle memory might get in the way. If you come to this afresh, it might actually be a benefit. So, as always people, thanks very much for watching and see you next time.